So, on to the Suns, and you'd have been a brave person to say they were going to be in the top 8 in 2024. But after another strong off-season, will this year be the same, or can this be the first time they finally make finals? My name's Woody, this is Wooden Spoon Data with the 18th best AFL content on YouTube, and in today's video we'll be taking a look back at the Suns' best 22 in 2024 to see where they excelled and where they could still improve. We can also add the players acquired over the offseason to determine what sort of changes Gold Coast might see in 2025 and if that would be enough for them to get into a contending spot for top 4. To do this, I've made a simple spreadsheet to compare Gold Coast players against the average player in the same position. We can also compare each player against the top 4 player in the same position over the last 5 years. I have taken some liberties to include best 22 players who missed large chunks of the season through injury, but have tried to have minor influence. So basically, I've taken every stat and every position and then compared stats between an average player in a given position and a top 4 player from the same position in the last 5 years to determine what stats are important for each position.
What is your favorite position?
For example, Touk Miller had 30 out of 42 important stats above the average midfielder last year, but that drops to 27 out of 42 if we were to raise that to a top 4 midfielder over the last 5 years. The average midfielder had 9.61 kicks per match last year, Touk had 12.06 and therefore was more than the average 2024 midfielder. But if we compare him to a top 4 mid over the last 5 years, where the average has been 12.12, he is lower than an average top 4 mid. Make sense? Good.
Good? Good.
So we did that for every position and every stat we deemed important for each position. Finally, once we determined the best 22 the Suns could field from last season and this coming, we can compare the players selected as a whole against the average production from a top 4 side over the last few years. So let's start with defense. The Suns' key defenders this past year were Sam Collins with 23 games, Charlie Ballard with 23 as well, and Mac Andrews with just 20 matches. With a total of 66 matches played across all their key defenders this past year, we can divide that number by 23 games and determine that the Suns average 2.87 key position defenders per match and prefer a 3 key position defensive structure. This and the ruck role were easily the best positions on ground for the Suns last year, with these players averaging over 62% of stats above that of a top 4 defender. Gold Coast did not add a key position defender with AFL experience to their list this offseason, so we'll obviously keep the 3 key position defenders for both 2024 and 2025. Now let's move on to the Suns' medium defenders. This year, Sam Flanders, Bodie Ueland, Will Powell, Alex Sexton and Joel Jeffrey all played over 12 games, with Connor Budarick playing 8 matches, Lockie Weller with 6, Sean Lemons and Rory Atkin played just the 3. With a total of 108 matches played across all their medium defenders this past year, dividing by 23 games, we can determine the Suns average and prefer roughly 4.7 medium defenders per match. The Suns added John Noble and Daniel Rioli to the medium defensive stocks this offseason, but let's lock down the 2024 side before coming back to them. Looking at stats above average, there's an obvious 3 stats-wise in Powell, Flanders and Ueland, so I'll give the starting medium defensive roles to them, at least in 2024, but who's joining them? In the 2024 lineup, I'll only be adding 1 medium defender on the bench. While Sexton, Jeffrey, Lemmings and Weller are a few points off each other, when looking at a top 4 comparison, it becomes pretty clear who the best option was. The more keen-eyed viewers might have noticed that Sexton actually went up a point. I've said this in other videos, so go back and watch them for further explanation and to see other stats like this, but there are certain stats where a top 4 player in the last 5 years has technically worse numbers than an average player. In this instance, the average 2024 medium defender had 0.56 frees against, and Sexton had more with 0.6, therefore he didn't get a point as he'd want lower frees against than the average. Whereas a top 4 medium defender over the last few years had 0.66 frees against, so Sexton did earn a point there. I've mentioned it before, but better players often get lower disposal efficiency and more frees against. This can be for a multitude of reasons, but as a general, they get to more contests and get the ball more than your average player. So that's the 2024 defensive lineup, but what sort of changes do we expect to see this year? Here we get back to the off-season inductees, Noble and Rioli. Both are immediate inclusions into the 2025 side, and I'm sure it isn't a huge surprise that Sexton gets the axe. But is anybody else going to be dropped? Personally, I'd keep things how they are defensively and find room from elsewhere in the 2024 side, so we'll come back to that in a moment. Considering there will be no more changes to the defensive lineup, we may as well change everyone's numbers to their top 4 above average numbers going forward. But let's have a look at the medium defenders versus top 4 medium defensive comparison chart. The starting 3 of Rioli, Flanders and Powell are pretty solid. Perhaps tackles could be improved upon, as it's the only stat where the sum of the 3 players are not better than 3 top 4 medium defenders. But I'm somewhat nitpicking, as it's less than 1 tackle. Considering Sexton is the only one changing for Noble and Rioli, let's focus on them for a second. Where Sexton is below target, Noble and Rioli are improvements on every stat but intercept marks. Moving to the overall output from the 2024 lineup, intercept marks were already 3 more than an average top 4 defense. In fact, legitimately everything is above target apart from tackles. Considering both Rioli and Noble get more tackles per match than Sexton, this should improve. I've already mentioned that this was one of the Suns' strongest line, but the inclusions this offseason should just improve this area. In 2024, the sum of the Suns' defensive output had 30 out of 37 important defensive stats above that of a top 4 defense. With this lineup going into 2025, the projected sum of Gold Coast's defensive output would see them move up to 32 out of 37 important defensive stats above that of a top 4 defender. Okay, so let's get on to the mids. This year, Noah Anderson, Matt Rowell, Tuke Miller, Braden Fiorini, Sam Closey, and Will Graham all played over 12 games, with Alex Davies playing 7 matches, the retired Brandis Ellis playing 4 matches, and the delisted Darcy McPherson playing just the 2. The Suns also added draftee Leo Lombard to their midfield stocks this offseason, but we'll come back to him in a moment. With a total of 126 matches played across all their midfielders this past year, we can divide by 23 and determine the Suns average and prefer 5.48 midfielders per match. Before looking at top 4 averages, there was a clear leader in Anderson, Miller and Rowell. But who else makes the 2024 and 2025 sides? After that, we see a slight drop off from Fiorini and Closey, but they'll get my other on-field roles. When looking at bench roles, while the Suns preferred 5 to 6 midfielders, I'm going to go for 6 in 2024, giving the final mid spot to Graham. But I'm going to go with 7 in 2025 and give that next bench role to draftee Leo Lombard. Firstly, I'm sure you're asking, how am I going to project Lombard's outputs if he hasn't played a match yet? Good question. I've explained it in previous club reviews though, so if you are asking that, go back and watch them at the end of this. But secondly, I'm going to be somewhat lazy. Because I don't have a good way to project lower level stats to AFL level, I'm just going to take the first year stats of the player they were compared to prior to the draft. Zero Hanger compared Lombard to Chad Warner. Considering in Warner's first season he only played 2 matches in the 2020 shortened matches, we'll be taking his second year stats. I've said it a few times, if you have better ideas, let me know. So that's the 2024 and 2025 mid lineups, as there'll be no more changes here. We'll also just show everyone's top 4 above average numbers going forward. So if we look at the players individually, things generally look pretty good across the board for the top 3. The one thing that stands out to me is average shots, where Anderson is the only one of those 3 above target. Otherwise, they're ahead for everything apart from tackles, where Anderson is now the only one below target. Where Closey, Fiorini and Graham are all below target, with the stats we've given to Lombard, he would be better than all of them. If we look at what that mid group as a whole averaged last year, we can see that they have very high handball receive numbers. But where I worry is that doesn't seem to translate to high inside 50 numbers. Where they're below target, they're within about 1 stat of everything but ground ball gets and score involvements. With the addition of Lombard, there is a good chance that that improves as well. In 2024, the sum of the Suns' midfield output had 22 out of 42 important midfield stats above that of a top 4 midfield. With this lineup for 2025, the projected sum of the Suns' midfield output would see them slightly move up to 23 out of 42 important stats above that of a top 4 midfield. So as a general, I'm a believer in the core of this mid group, and the mix of experience and youth leads me to think there's a fair bit of improvement left to go too. Suns fans will hope it'll be this year it all clicks, and it starts with the hit out, so let's move on to the ruck. Last year, Jared Witts and Ned Moyle were the only two ruckmen the Suns played. Gold Coast picked up Max Noble from Freo via the rookie draft, but I don't think he's really challenging for a spot in the side, so we won't really be discussing him much further either. When it comes down to picking who's best for the role, Moyle is still a fair bit behind Witts with a basic overview, but the difference is more pronounced when you look at top 4 numbers. Like Sexton earlier, Witts also goes up a point. In this instance, Witts averaged 3.062 clangers per match. The average 2024 ruck had 3.06. So because he averaged 0.002 more clangers, he didn't get a point. Whereas an average top 4 ruck from the last few years averaged 3.27 clangers per match. So he does end up getting a point there. Again, he gets more disposals than the average 2024 ruck and just quietly a top 4 ruck too. So basically, when you get more of the ball, you're more likely to have higher turnover and clanger numbers. So with that, we'll pick Witts for both 2024 and 2025. We can't do much of a comparison here, so we'll jump straight into some of his stats. Looking at the ruck chart, Witts is ahead of target for every stat except total marks. If we look at Moyle quickly, as he's clearly the successor to Witts, he is also behind target for marks, but he needs to improve his score involvements too. I mentioned it at the start of the video, but these stats suggest that the key defenders and rucks are the Suns' strongest positions. I actually think the ruck role is slightly stronger as Moyle is a genuine backup, whereas they regularly play their 3 key position defenders. So let's look at the forwards and the changes to next year's lineup before we get to conclusions. Gold Coast key forwards in 2024 were Ben King, the delisted Sam Day, and the retired Levi Casbolt, as well as first-year players Jed Walter and Ethan Reed. The Suns also picked up former Crow Elliot Himmelberg in the off-season via free agency. With a total of 48 matches played across all their key forwards this past year, again divided by 23 games, we can tell the Suns average and prefer 2.09 key forwards per match. With the addition of Himmelberg, I will be selecting 3 key forwards in 2025, but I will only be going for 2 for this last year. So who was best? Clearly King makes the side, but does Day or Casbolt with their higher averages manage to get the spot over youngster Walter, who played more games? For those of you that have watched these team reviews before, you'll know what the sum of important stats are. But for those of you watching this for the first time, we use 70 player stats against a top 4 player in the same role to determine the effectiveness of the 6 different player types we use. So when you compare the sum of important player stats above an average top 4 team at the end of everything, while Day was better than Casbolt when comparing the output of Day and Walters, they ended up being a net 0, which means the Suns ended up with the same score with either. So I'll give the last key forward role to Walter. So we've gone over who will be in the starting 2024 and 2025 key forward roles. So let's have a look at the key forwards chart. In general, Ben King is either just below or just above target in most areas, but I'm pretty happy with what I see. Even though there is a fair bit of room for improvement, he is already averaging more shots and goals than a top 4 key position forward. Walter has a fair bit to work on, and while I'm fairly convinced most of that comes with size and experience, he needs to get more marks on lead, or at least contested marks. When looking at what Himmelberg could bring, we can see that he averages more than Walter in every stat bar shots. That being said, he is also below King in everything but disposals too. As a group, I do wonder if these 3 can work together. They'll need to be on top of their marks, or at least have the mid-medium forwards getting above average crumbing numbers. So let's quickly look at the mid-medium forwards. The mid-medium forwards for the Suns this past year were the departed Jack Lukosius, Bailey Humphrey, Nick Holman, David Swallow, Ben Ainsworth, Ben Long, and they all played more than 17 matches. With Jake Rogers playing 9, Lloyd Johnson and Malcolm Roses playing just 7. With a total of 157 matches played across all the Suns' mid-medium forwards this past year, dividing by 23, we can see they average and prefer 6.83 or roughly 7 medium forwards per match. I will only be going for 6 mid-medium forwards in 2024, but because of the additions in the offseason, I'll actually only be going with 3 for the 2025 lineup. But I'll also explain why in a second. There was a standout 3 in that role being Lukosius, Ainsworth, and Long. But who else gets the other roles for the 2024 lineup? Well, Humphrey, Holman, and Berry are the next best rated, both when compared to the 2024 average and against a top 4 player in the same role. So those 3 get the final spots in the 2024 side, but I mentioned earlier that I'd only be going with 3 medium forwards for the 2025 side. I'm sure when you saw the numbers, you would have just assumed it was the 3 with the biggest numbers, excluding Lukosius, of course, but that isn't the case. As I mentioned earlier, we use stats against the average and a top 4 average to determine the effectiveness of each player type. We also use cumulative averages to see if they surpass the expected output of a top 4 defense, midfield, ruck line, and forward line, to see if the group might work well together or not. So with that in mind, when looking at the sum of everything, Ainsworth and Humphrey stay in the lineup, but Ben Long misses out, as many of the benefits he brought to the team are covered by the new additions, whereas Holman brings more in aspects that are still needed, such as crumbing, tackles, and pressure acts, so he gets the final mid-medium forward role in 2025. So that's the 2024 and 2025 lineups. It's time to have a look at the mid-medium forwards charts before we look at the overall forward line output. Looking at the 2024 mid-medium forwards first, everyone's output is below target in ground ball gets. Everyone but Holman is below target for tackles, and everyone but Berry and the now departed Lukosius is behind target for inside 50s. Also, we've already seen that the key forwards aren't taking a massive amount of contested marks or marks on lead. So if the mid-medium forwards aren't delivering the ball in there, why are crumbs either just below or above target, with the exception of Holman's good work and Ainsworth's bad work? I feel like this needs to be an area of strength if the Suns aren't going to be a massive marking threat inside 50. But let's have a look at the overall numbers from last year to see if my suspicions are correct. And yeah, when you look at the overall forwards average output in 2024 from this lineup, total marks are well below target, and this can be seen in contested marks, marks inside 50, and marks on lead. Crumbs are actually basically bang on where you'd want them. Again, more would be better, but when ground ball gets, pressure acts, and simply inside 50s are below target, I start to think the half forward line isn't getting enough done. This is partially why I think a 3 medium forward structure might be the best way to start the season this year. With the additions this offseason, there should be more rebound 50s from the defensive line and inside 50s from the midfield. This hopefully generates more offensive 1v1s and crumbing opportunities, putting further emphasis on the forwards to actually do more when they get their opportunity. And they could always bring more mid-medium forwards back in. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. I'll go over that more in the conclusion in a second. First, let's look at the differences between the sums of each lineup. In 2024, the sum of Gold Coast forward line output had 15 out of 51 important forward stats above that of a top 4 forward line. With this lineup for 2025, the projected sum of the Suns forward line output would see them remain with 15 out of 51 important stats above that of a top 4 forward line. Considering there was 2 bench spots previously held by mid-medium forwards, I am optimistic that with further opportunity and potentially even another youngster bobbing up, that this number is lower than what we'll see come end of the year.
So, what have we learned?
So, before we go over some final numbers, upon reflection, what have we learned? The defense was solid with 30 out of 37 or roughly 81% of important stats above that of a top 4 defense. But there could still be improvement to come, as with the changes to this lineup, we now expect to see 32 out of 37 or roughly 86% of stats above that of a top 4 defense, and positions the Suns as the best defensive unit we've reviewed so far.
He's got the best grades in the house!
The Suns midfield is by no means an area of weakness, but still has things they could improve upon, with 22 out of 42 or roughly 52% of important midfield stats above that of a top 4 mid group. We also expect to see a minor rise in production here to 23 out of 42 or roughly 55% of a top 4 mid group. While I do think further development takes care of a fair bit of what's required, if I were to suggest anything to focus on, their overlap handballs don't seem to generate enough inside 50s, and they just need to get it inside 50 more. When looking at the ruck stats, Witts has 32 out of 43 or roughly 74% of important ruck stats above that of a top 4 ruck, and his protege Moyle has 19 out of 43 or roughly 44% of important ruck stats above a top 4 ruck. This is another area I have good confidence in, and honestly don't have much in terms of suggestions. On to the forwards. With only 15 out of 51 or roughly 29% of important forward stats above a top 4 side, this is an area that needs addressing the most for the Suns. I mentioned it earlier, but with further depth to an already strong defense and midfield stocks, I think the Suns get the ball inside 50 next year, but that isn't the main issue. The Suns were third for inside 50s generated last year with 56.1 per match. The side we've put together in 2024 could have been second with Brisbane on 56.5. Their shots at goal per inside 50 rate was third last with only 43.6%, and their goal per inside 50 rate was fourth last at only 21.8%. To win more matches next year, they need to get better shots at goal per inside 50, and to do that they need to generate more offensive 1v1s, marks on lead, contested marks, and crumbs from packs. And if none of that works, tackles and pressure acts and 1%ers. As mentioned earlier, in total we use 70 player stats against a top 4 player in the same role to determine the effectiveness of the 6 different player types we use. We also use player cumulative averages to see if they surpass the expected output of a top 4 defense, midfield, ruck line, and forward line to see if the group might work well together or not. Technically, we can look at those 70 important stats across all lines to see how the whole team fares against an average top 4 side. In 2024, the sum of Gold Coast output had 25 out of 70, or roughly 36% of important stats above that of a top 4 side. With this lineup for 2025, the projected sum of the Suns' output would see them with 27 out of 70, or roughly 39% of important stats above a top 4 side. So, as a general, I think the Suns are slated to improve this year, but with so many teams on the up, if it's actually enough to make their first finals berth is another question entirely. I'll do some prediction videos as we get closer to the season, but Wheeler Ratings has them with a 34.4% chance of making the finals and a 12.8% chance of making the top 4. Thank you for watching our assessment of the Suns 2024 team and what some of the changes they've made in the offseason might bring. My name's Woody, this is Wooden Spoon Data with the 18th best AFL content on YouTube. If you'd like to see more data-focused AFL videos, you can click the subscribe button to be kept up to date. The notification bell is also up there. I think that does better at keeping you up to date. YouTube also suggests videos for you these days, so if you're interested in that, go have a look. Thanks again, have a good one.
I passed! I gotta pee! Yeah.